All right, let's read another Rambler. Today it will be Rambler number 46 for Saturday, August 25th, 1750. The title of which is The Mischiefs of Rural Faction. Of course, by Dr. Samuel Johnson. And we're reading this from this beautiful 200-year-old volume. Here we go. It opens with a bit of Latin here that translates, "Not from my birth or ancestors I claim. All is my own, my honor and my shame." That's a bit from Ovid. To the Rambler. Sir, since I find that you have paid so much regard to my complaints as to publish them, I am inclined by vanity or gratitude to continue our correspondence, and indeed, without either of these motives, am glad of an opportunity to write, for I am not accustomed to keep in anything that swells my heart, and have here none with whom I can freely converse. While I am thus employed, some tedious hours will slip away, and when I return to watch the clock, I shall find that I have disburdened myself of part of the day. You perceive that I do not pretend to write with much consideration of anything but my own convenience, and, not to conceal from you my real sentiments, the little time which I have spent, against my will, in solitary meditation has not much contributed to my veneration for authors. I have now sufficient reason to suspect that, with all your splendid professions of wisdom and seeming regard for truth, you have very little sincerity. That you either write what you do not think, and willingly impose upon mankind, or that you take no care to think right, but while you set up yourself as guides, mislead your followers by credulity or negligence. That you produce to the public whatever notions you can speciously maintain or elegantly express, without inquiring whether they are just, and transcribed hereditary falsehoods from old authors, perhaps as ignorant and careless as yourselves. You may perhaps wonder that I express myself with so much acrimony on a question in which women are supposed to have very little interest. And you are likely enough, for I have seen many instances of the sauciness of scholars to tell me that I am more properly employed in playing with my kittens than in giving myself airs of criticism and censuring the learned. But you are mistaken, if you imagine that I am to be intimidated by your contempt or silenced by your reproofs. As I read, I have a right to judge. As I read, I have a right to judge. As I am injured, I have a right to complain. And these privileges, which I have purchased at so dear a rate, I shall not easily be persuaded to resign. To read has, indeed, never been my business, but as there are hours of leisure in the most active life, I have passed the superfluities of time which the diversions of the town left upon my hands in turning over a large collection of tragedies and romances, where, amongst other sentiments common to all authors of this class, I have found almost every page filled with the charms and happiness of a country life. That life to which every statesman, in the highest elevation of his prosperity, is contriving to retire. That life to which every tragic heroine in some scene or other wishes to have been born, and which is represented as a certain refuge from folly, from anxiety, from passion, and from guilt. It is impossible to read so many passionate exclamations and soothing descriptions without feeling some desire to enjoy the state in which all this felicity was to be enjoyed. And therefore I received with raptures the invitation of my good aunt, and expected that by some unknown influence I should find all hopes and fears, jealousies and competitions vanish from my heart upon my first arrival at the seats of innocence and tranquillity. That I should sleep in halcyon bowers, and wander in Elysian gardens, where I should meet with nothing but the softness of benevolence, the candor of simplicity, and the cheerfulness of content. where I should see reason exerting her sovereignty over life, without any interruption from envy, avarice, or ambition, and every day passing in such a manner as the severest wisdom should approve. This, Mr. Rambler, I tell you I expected, and this I had by 100 authors been taught to expect. But by this expectation I was led hither, and here I live in perpetual uneasiness, without any other comfort than that of hoping to return to London. Having since I wrote my former letter been driven, by the mere necessity of escaping from absolute inactivity, to make myself more acquainted with the affairs and inhabitants of this place, I am now no longer an absolute stranger to rural conversation and employments, but am far from discovering in them more innocence or wisdom than in the sentiments or conduct of those with whom I have passed more cheerful and more fashionable hours. It is common to reproach the tea-table and the park with giving opportunities and encouragement to scandal. I cannot wholly clear them from the charge, but must, however, observe in favor of the modish prattlers that, if not by principle, we are at least by accident less guilty of defamation than the country ladies. For having greater numbers to observe and censure, we are commonly content to charge them only with their own faults or follies, and seldom give way to malevolence, but such as arises from some injury or affront, real or imaginary, offered to ourselves. But in these distant provinces, where the same families inhabit the same houses from age to age, they transmit and recount the faults of a whole succession. I have been informed how every estate in the neighborhood was originally got, and find, if I may credit the accounts given me, that there is not a single acre in the hands of the right owner. I have been told of intrigues between beaux and toasts, and have been now 3 centuries in their quiet graves, and am often entertained with traditional scandal on persons of whose names there would have been no remembrance, had they not committed somewhat that might disgrace their descendants. In one of my visits, I happened to commend the air and dignity of a young lady who had just left the company, upon which 2 grave matrons looked with great slyness at each other, and the elder asked me whether I had ever seen the picture of Henry VIII. You may imagine that I did not immediately perceive the propriety of the question, but after having waited a while for information, I was told that the lady's grandmother had a great-great-grandmother that was an attendant of Anne Boleyn, and supposed to have been too much a favorite of the king. If once there happens a quarrel between the principal persons of 2 families, the malignity is continued without end, and it is common for old maids to fall out about the same election in which their grandfathers were competitors. The heart-burnings of the Civil War are not yet extinguished. There are 2 families in the neighborhood who have destroyed each other's game from the time of Philip and Mary, and when an account came of an inundation which had injured the plantations of a worthy gentleman, one of the hearers remarked with exultation that he might now have some notion of the ravages committed by his ancestors in their retreat from Bosworth. Thus malice and hatred descend here with an inheritance, and it is necessary to be well versed in history that the various factions of this country may be understood. You cannot expect to be on good terms with families who are resolved to love nothing in common, and, in selecting your intimates, you are perhaps to consider which party you most favor in the Barons' wars. I have often lost the good opinion of my aunt's visitants by confounding the interests of York and Lancaster, and was once censured for sitting silent when William Rufus was called a tyrant. I have, however, now thrown aside all pretenses to circumspection, for I find it impossible in less than 7 years to learn all the requisite cautions. At London, if you know your company and their parents, you are safe, but you are here suspected of alluding to the slips of grandmothers, and of reviving contests which were decided in armor, by the redoubted knights of ancient times. I hope, therefore, that you will not condemn my impatience if I am weary of attending where nothing can be learned, and of quarreling where there is nothing to contest, and that you will contribute to divert me while I stay here by some facetious performance. I am, sir, Euphalia. Wow. Now, I'll take that as a caution to myself as I'm angling my way towards a life in the Japanese countryside. Now, of course, I won't need to be involved with any of that business of the gossip of the countryside, but good to keep in mind and to remember, as Dr. Johnson once said, famously said, a man who is tired of London is tired of life. I'll leave it at that. Thanks for joining me.